I'm Jeneline, hiding behind the phone. Yes.
Both of us are currently contagious with COVID. We've tested COVID positive. However, due to the miracles of the internet, we should not be contagious to you. We are sending you good vibes this morning. Good morning. Welcome to our weekly Introduction to Philosophy and Theory class. My name is Julian, and to my left,
I'm Jeneline. Welcome to our COVID isolation pod / studio.
/ philosophy contemplation cell. So today's kind of a big day because today is the final class in the Where Nothing is Lacking Intro to Žižek, Lacan, Marx, Kant, Hegel, whatever series, which means that we are in week 12 of what has been a 12-week exploration of various ideas relating to German idealism, Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis, and of course Žižek's application of said psychoanalysis to German idealism back to Marxism and dialectical materialism. Now, in this class, we're going to wrap up some loose threads. This is going to be perhaps not the peak of the class, but this is going to be the final class. However, if you are joining us for the very first time today,
You're just in time.
Fret not. You are just in time.
Yes, because all of these classes are saved on both Instagram and YouTube, as well as the audio being available on our Patreon for your listening pleasure or your reading pleasure, as the case may be. In addition, I'm doing all the announcements. I'm getting it all out of the way.
Okay,
Additionally, this is the last month, the last couple of weeks. To
2
download
weeks, right?
the ebook, the current ebook, The Vanishing Mediator, until it too vanishes and is replaced by the next book, Where Nothing is Lacking.
That's right. Yeah, for the next 2 weeks, you can still buy my ebook called The Vanishing Mediator, which is based on the previous lecture series. It's a 100-page version of that 12-week series. And then as soon as this month ends, you will, as a patron, have access to the ebook that summarizes this lecture series, which is called Where Nothing is Lacking. So stick around if you want to find out what Where Nothing is Lacking means. Stick around if you'd like to learn about Žižek's theory of less than nothing. Stick around if you'd like to learn a little bit about my own chiasmic theory. And stick around if you'd like to learn about Lacan, Hegel, Kant, etc. This class is designed both for complete beginners and for those who remain perpetual beginners, aka experts. This is my favorite Goethe quote, although Goethe has many good quotes, which he says that, I should get it in Latin, I should probably get it right, if I want to be really pretentious, which is bonus vir semper tiro, I think, which means the good man is always a beginner. But in classic Goethean wit, it also means the good man is also a fool. So if you'd like to be a fool together with us, please spend the next 60 minutes sitting here as we delve deeply into the rabbit hole of philosophy and theory. All right, I think we can start.
I've done my part. I'm cocooning myself in.
Jeneline,
I'm ready. Let us know where you're joining us from also. We are back in the very cold Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
spring has yet to arrive.
This is like a genuine request. If you're watching this and you are not in the United States of America, first of all, good for you. As in, like, actually good for you, not sarcastically. Please let us know where you're joining us from.
Even if you are in the U.S., let us know.
Okay, yeah. We're not creating a hierarchy here. But what I'm trying to say, very ineloquently, is that it brings us so much joy to know that people from around the world are coming together to enjoy these open access classes. There is no way that you could in any way ever express that in a monetary value. That is what makes this the best day of our week. Mm-hmm. So, and it's also what animates us to do this, even though we have been sick as dogs for the past week. Hopefully it doesn't show too much, but we've had a COVID battle. So if you guys have been sick or know people who are sick, then please also know that we send our love and our support and our solidarity to all of the many coughing people around the world. So far I haven't coughed, but somewhere in this class I will succumb to a fit of
This
coughing.
class is where we turn the corner in terms of our health.
I think so, yeah, fingers crossed. Yes. And tomorrow they had pneumonia.
Either turning the corner or going round the bend.
Yeah.
I feel like those are two important distinctions.
We see some people
English
from
idioms.
Texas, West Hollywood, Switzerland, etc.
I saw Long Island, Sweden.
That's wonderful. Please keep that coming. It really genuinely brings us a lot of joy to see that we are connected to all of you guys. Okay, let's just jump right in because this is, like, as I said, the last class in the series, so I want to make sure that we that we do it justice, as it were. And hello to our friends from Indonesia. I just want to briefly say that's so cool. Like that's genuinely just so cool. Like honestly, this is the part that makes me happy. Is when we just get to have people join us from around the world. Okay, let us begin. The title for this class is Epor si muove, which is something that Žižek writes about in his book Less Than Nothing. His book Less Than Nothing being his book on Hegel. I mean, technically all of Žižek's books are on Hegel, but this is like his quote-unquote Hegel magnum opus. And if you watched the class from last week, you'll know that there was a pretty lengthy introduction to that book and to the ideas in that book. So hopefully you can see last week's class and this week's class as a back-to-back. And Žižek writes about this idea, Epor si muove, which is of course not his idea, but it's a reference to what supposedly Galileo is to have said at his trial, a trial at which he confessed that, in fact, the Earth did not move around the sun, that the scientific discovery that the Earth is in fact not the center of the universe was disavowed. And according to legend has it, and of course, whenever legend has something, it means that truth may not. But according to legend, Galileo is to have confessed, after having been showed an extensive tour of the various torture features that would be used to extract his confession anyway. He is to have confessed, and supposedly under his breath to have muttered, Epor si muove, which in Latin translates to,
And yet it moves.
and yet it moves, exactly. Someone should make a t-shirt that says, with a cow on it, that says, and yet it moves. That'd be really good, right?
I thought it was a deathbed utterance. We had like a thing going for a while of great deathbed lines.
Yeah. The
was
famous
sort of
Freudian
recanting.
one,
Yes.
the one, I mean, not for, both Freudian and of Freud is, of course, the famous one, Was will das Weib, which is what does woman want? That was the deathbed utterance, which we can talk more about another time. And yet it moves, or and yet it moves. This is also, there was for a while these t-shirts that were being sold. I think it was after Elizabeth Warren said,
Nonetheless, she persisted.
Nonetheless, she persisted, etc. So there's a certain dramatic tension here. But Galileo, having supposedly just confessed that that what he knew to be true was supposedly untrue, is to have muttered under his breath, and yet it moves. In this class, we're going to talk a little bit about how the principle of and yet it moves, Epor si muove, can be related to the idea of the subject and to the idea of utopia, which is another way of saying that it's a way of linking Hegel and Marx through Lacan, which is, of course, what Žižek does, and we're going to try to extrapolate how he does that and why it's so interesting. Now, on a very basic level, you could read the story of Galileo muttering Epor si muove under his breath as being about the fact that truth, even though if it is professed to being untrue, remains true. For example, just because you say the world, the Earth, doesn't revolve around the sun, it's not like it's going to stop revolving around the sun. It's like we can pretend it's untrue, and yet it remains true. So you could read it as a principle of the unbending truth of scientific discovery, no matter what dogma tells us. And yet, if you're alive today, which I'm assuming you are, you will also be aware that the opposite can be true. That just because something is false doesn't mean that it is true. Think about how in politics today, politicians will say things that are blatantly untrue, that are complete fabrications, that are in fact malicious lies designed to create feelings of hatred or animosity, misinformation, disinformation. Just because we know that something is false doesn't mean that it doesn't have the impact of being true. Just because we know the American election wasn't stolen doesn't mean that the great lie doesn't have great political force. And so one of the slightly unnerving things about the Galilean expression is that it's not just an expression of unfettered truth, but it's also an expression of the impotency of truth, of how, in a sense, that something can be true and yet be unacknowledged, and yet vice versa, can be untrue and have true consequences. In fact, that often it's precisely the untruths, the lies, the misinformations, even those that we know to be untrue, that we are powerless to stop from having true impact on people's lives. And so already here we have a dialectical relationship between truth and falsehood and the way in which truth and falsehood is manifested. Another example of this, Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, always insisted, and we've done classes on this, that there is no big other. And yet it's precisely because there is no big other that we act as if there is one, which is another way of saying that just because there is a God doesn't mean that God knows that he is dead. It's something that Lacan joked about apropos of the existentialists when he said that the existentialists may have killed God, but they forgot to tell God. For Lacan, the idea is that the big other is powerful precisely because of his absence. This is both a theological statement on the dialectic of presence and absence, the fact that the figure of the father, the figure of the mother, whether it's in the heavenly realm or in the earthly realm, functions precisely as a figure of longing, as a figure that we desire through detachment. And yet, vice versa, it's also precisely the principle for Lacan that all presence functions as a kind of absence. That desire is precisely the motion by which we understand our own selves as subjective beings, as agents of desire, as agents of the unfolding of the pursuit of that which we desire. And when Žižek talks about the ticklish subject, as we talked about in previous classes, he's talking about the objet petit a. In other words, what makes us desire, the desiring principle, the thing that makes us desire. That's what tickles us. It's the object cause of our desire. And this means that just because we know that there is no God doesn't mean that the world doesn't function as if there were a God, both in a literal sense, because we live in a largely predominantly religious world, but also in a very strict sense that we live in the snares of the symbolic order. We relate to others by means of a vast network of sociopolitical principles that are both structural, that are legal, that are religious, but are also simply moral and ethical and part of the framework in which we understand what it means to be polite in a society. We play along. And so just because we know it's fake doesn't mean that it doesn't have real consequences. That's Lacan's fundamental insight when he says there is no big other. It's to say, just because something isn't true doesn't make it not real. More importantly, just because something isn't real doesn't make it not true. And what Lacan's trying to say is that it's not accidental that what isn't real and what isn't there has presence and is real. It's precisely what doesn't exist that is made manifest through presence. Now, that's very abstract, so let's take a little bit of time to unpack that a little bit. Lacan says, reality is structured like a fantasy. What does he mean by that? Well, first of all, he means that the way in which we engage with the very idea of reality itself on a conceptual level has to be thought. In other words, it has to be conceptualized. Secondly, that the way in which we make reality fungible, touchable, experienceable is precisely by means of non-real participation, whether it's through art, whether it's through literature, whether it's through cinema. Remember, Žižek says that cinema is not ideological because it has an agenda. Cinema is ideological because it teaches us how to desire, it teaches us how to dream, and it gives us the coordinates by which we navigate those dreams. This is also why Lacan says that reality isn't just structured like a fiction, but the subject is structured like a fiction. The way in which we experience ourselves has a narrative arc to it. The way in which we go through our lives is distinctly shaped by the narrative that we imbue our position apropos the world with. In other words, we are in the symbolic order, and yet we sustain our relationship to the symbolic order by means of the imaginary. Now, underneath this relationship that we have to the symbolic order, a symbolic order that has no overarching God or deity or purpose. Remember, there is no big other. An overarching symbolic order through which we relate on an imaginary basis, an imaginary layer that is sustained through the tickling experience of the objet petit a, the object cause of desire. Underneath this, we have the real. Underneath this, we have the real being the principle that even though it is false, it is still real. Even though there is nothing there, there is precisely something, and yet it moves. Žižek has a little anecdote that he takes from a short story from an American writer whose name I can no longer remember, in which a couple is driving through the American Midwest, and they're hot in the car. And so at a certain point, the driver wants to lower the window. He cranks the window. And as soon as the window goes down, there's just the void, there's just blackness. And they have a moment of panic and they try to crank the window up as quickly as possible to shut it. And they shut the window and everything goes back to the idyll that it was. There's the scenery outside, there's the couple in the car, they're going on holiday. And this momentary realization, this intrusion of the real, is the intrusion of the void, the intrusion of nothingness. In other words, the slightly horrific and yet tantalizing discovery that between the cracks of the symbolic and the real, there is precisely a constitutive negativity, a kind of pure void or ultimate abyss. And this, of course, as we said last week, is the metaphysical question. The metaphysical question is not, why is there something when there could be nothing? How did something emerge out of nothing? The metaphysical question is, why is there nothing when there is so much something? Why is it that there is a nothingness that persists between the cracks of everything that is material that exists? Why is it that we only access reality through fantasy? Why is it that we can't look behind the so-called Parisian veil? Why is it that in the transcendental divide we can't reach beyond the world of appearances to reach the ideal form? That's the metaphysical question that we've been trying to answer throughout this lecture series. Okay, so that's a little bit of setup, but by now, if you missed the past 11 weeks, you should probably sort of roughly know where we're going. Okay, so what is the importance of the idea of epor si muove, and yet it moves? Well, we could relate this to the Freudian idea of the slip, which we, of course, refer to as the Freudian slip. Freud did not call this the Freudian slip. I feel like... Anyway, so what is the idea of the Freudian slip? The Freudian slip, as we commonly know it in day-to-day society, is the idea that you say something that you didn't intend to. And often this has a humorous quality. Remember, most humor simply comes from tension, comedic tension, and something emerging where it shouldn't. In fact, something being unexpected or out of place is one of the key aspects of humor. For example, if you went into your kitchen and you opened your kitchen drawer, and who did you find? You find your grandmother in the kitchen drawer. This would be comedic, but also potentially slightly horrific. Freud is always aware of the fact that there's a very fine line between the canny and the uncanny. And that is precisely the horrific in the normal, right? It's not that we have the monster versus the familiar, it's that we have the monstrosity within the familiar itself. But I'll get to that in a moment. So what is the Freudian slip? On a basic level, the Freudian slip can be broken down into three parts. You have that which you want to say, you have that which you say, and then you have that which you say but didn't intend to say. Usually something embarrassing about, I don't know, with sexual innuendo, or you're trying to say that you are advocating war, advocating peace, but actually you're advocating war, something like this. Usually we see with politicians, people who have to speak under a high-pressure situation, and it's humorous for us that we see them sort of stumble through their words. Classic Freudian slip. As an educator, I've made many Freudian slips myself in the classroom. I think this has occurred to you as well many a time. Okay, so let's look at this formal structure. So strictly speaking, it appears as if we have three parts, right? As I said, we have that which you want to say, that which you say, and that which you didn't want to say, that which slipped out. Now, what's important for Freud is that the slip isn't a reveal. In other words, we don't have me hiding something and the hidden thing accidentally comes out. It's not that I go to my parents and I want to tell them that everything is fine, but actually it's not, and secretly the not fineness slips out. That's not what a Freudian slip is. It's not that you're trying to hide something from the recipient of your speech and that thing comes through beneath the lines. So already we have a sense that, well, maybe it's more complicated than just what I wanted to say, what I said, and what came out. And so what Freud argues, and this is much more interesting, is he says that the third part, the thing you say, wasn't there in the first place. In other words, it has nothing to do with what you were hiding. It doesn't have a kernel of truth. It's not a symbol of your original intent. This is one of the many false ways in which we commonly interpret the Freudian slip. We say, well, the person speaking had a secret thought that he wanted to hide from us, and yet it came out, and yet it moved. And yet for Freud, it's completely the opposite. It's that you were hiding something, and something else came out, which is much worse. It's almost like imagine that you're trying to stifle a cough and instead you let out a loud fart. It's like there's this third element that you weren't even trying to repress, an element that is a pure creation of repression itself. That is the third part. And so the thing that you say, the thing that slips out in the Freudian slip, isn't another form of the original repression, the thing you didn't want to say or think. It's something entirely new. And this is what makes it... Take a sip of water here before I start coughing. And this is, of course, how the Freudian slip relates to the uncanny. Now, remember, for Freud, the uncanny, which is a book that I would recommend by Freud, actually, it's probably the first book by Freud that I read. The uncanny is already in the statement, "Et pour si muove," and yet it moves. Anybody who's ever watched a horror movie knows that one of the principles of what makes something spooky is when something moves when it shouldn't. On the one hand, this could be you walk into a room and there's an item that has been misplaced. Suddenly something is gone or missing. But it could also be something that is, in principle, not supposed to move, moves. I think that most of us have some uncanny awareness of the spookiness of dolls or mannequins or statues. This is one of the sequences in Doctor Who where the angels, the statues, the weeping angels will only move when you're not looking at them. So as long as you look at them, they don't move. As soon as you turn around, they creep up on you. This is what Freud would call the uncanny. It's when life is brought to that which is lifeless. But vice versa, it could also be the stillness to something which is alive. Let's say you walk into the kitchen one morning and your parent is there and they are unmoving in a kind of silent, rigor mortis, transfixed state of paralysis. This would be uncanny and unnerving. What Freud is trying to point out is that what we fear is not so much a negation of something. What we fear is not, for example, that life will end. What we fear is that there's a kind of death within life itself. This is also what you could relate to the idea that Lacan has about the symbolic death, which is that we can be very alive and yet somehow dead inside. We can be going through the motions. You could be in a job that stifles you. You could be in a relationship that smothers you. You could be in a state of being that feels somehow alienated from what you imagined life could be. There are many ways in which we suffer a symbolic death, both to ourselves and to others. But of course, where Freud and Lacan are a little bit devious is that they say that suffering such a symbolic death is also a precondition for experiencing life itself. This is the process and the principle of the death drive. The death drive is the process by which you experience life more fully and more richly, precisely by dehumanizing yourself in a kind of death-like torpor. Whether it's going to a concert and experiencing a mosh pit and suddenly feeling more alive than ever at the exact point that you've turned yourself into a flailing sardine with other sweaty sardines. This is what, and I've said this before, what the French call the petit mort, right? The moment of orgasm in which for a blissful instant you let go of your own state of being and you succumb to this kind of passionate embrace with the other person, presumably, unless the other person is your phone. Sorry, I'm too juvenile for this. And so the paradox of subjectivity is in a sense uncanny, which is that we experience life at the exact moment that we subject ourselves to a form of alienation and dehumanization, to a form of symbolic death. And that it is yet on the flip side of that, that we also experience ourselves as being entombed within our own life, as being already dead before we even began to live. This is the paradoxical split that we inhabit on a day-to-day basis. This also means that there's something uncanny to the idea of being alive itself, that on the one hand, life is that which doesn't move. Life is simply that which negates. Life is that which moves towards its own inevitable end. And yet life is also that which continues on. Life is that which will be there without you once you're gone. One of the fundamentally unnerving insights about your own mortality isn't that you will be gone, it's that other people will live on after you are. And so you have to find a way to switch that, to invert that, and to find precisely the purpose of life within that realization. That it is because other people will live once you are gone that you now have a reason and a purpose to keep on living yourself. And so all of these things aren't just paradoxes, but they're dialectical mediations. In other words, they feed each other. And this is an awareness that Freud has that Lacan continues into the idea of the death drive and the idea of the split subject, that what makes us subject, what makes us individual, isn't our completeness. In fact, the very idea of being complete as a thinking, feeling subject is the ultimate illusion. What grants us access to subjectivity is our alienation. What grants us access to alienation is the illusion that we have subjectivity. And so we're stuck within a very fruitful error. And when I say fruitful error, we're already back at almost a theological idea, which is that perhaps life is precisely the mistake that should have never happened, and yet the mistake that made everything worthwhile. In the same way that a relationship can often feel like a mistake, and yet a mistake that brings your mind and your passion and your soul and your being to life. This is something that I believe very strongly, is that even as we move and progress towards life, and if we have the experience and the wisdom of hindsight, that hopefully your life should be, I don't know, more of an ember and less a dredge. That it should burn more intensely rather than feeling like it is being filtered out. And this is one of the beauties of life, right? Is that it's not that you start with completeness and that over the course of your lifetime, you sort of slowly become like a deflated balloon. It's the opposite. It's that the more you live, the more capable you are of inhabiting the richness, including the contradictories, the highs and the lows, the pain and the suffering, the joy and the elation of what it means to be alive. And so you glow until you become an ember, rather than becoming drained until you are a dredge. That's, to me, a really important realization about life, is that it's precisely because you have lived that you are more capable of living. Okay, that's a little bit of a digression, but I think it's important that we emphasize these things. And I know I'm going fast. Apologies. We have 60 minutes, and I'm a motor mouth. What can I say? Okay. So we're still talking about ep or simuov. We're talking about the idea of the death drive. We're talking about the idea of the uncanny. All these ideas are swirling around. And yet there's also, as always, a metaphysical argument here. Remember, we were talking briefly about the idea that the question isn't so much, how did something come from nothing? The classic sort of theological idea that there was darkness in the void, and out of this darkness we have the Edenic garden. And as Jenlin put it, I think, in a conversation we had the other day, when you were editing the previous class, Eden is kind of a mirror version of this. We have a kind of exit from the Garden of Eden. There's
something from nothing mirrored with nothing from something.
Exactly. And so the question isn't, how could there be something in what appeared to be nothing? The question is, how is there nothing in what appears to be something? In other words, how is nothingness the animating drive within that which we experience as having fully given form? How is what Lacan and Freud call the death drive precisely the animating spark within life itself? And this is where Žižek makes a slightly interesting argument. I mean, I think quite interesting argument. That here we have a metaphysical idea. That we're also saying something about what philosophers will call teleology. A teleological argument is different from an ontic argument. An ontic argument is about the purpose of something. A teleological argument is about the origin of something. Did I get that? No, I got it wrong. Did I get it wrong? My brain's a bit foggy today.
No, I don't think so.
No. I got it totally wrong. Ontic argument is about the origin of something. Teleological argument is about the purpose of something. But of course, the two are related. If we're talking about where something comes from, we're talking about where something is going. In other words, if something comes from nothing, then it is going towards something, presumably. Here we have the sort of vulgar deterministic argument of the Marxist teleology. Žižek's teleology can be summarized as such. What if the fall creates the thing from which it is falling? Now, we can break this down into at least three layers. On the one hand, there's a theological argument here, a theological argument that Žižek practically takes from Hegel. For Hegel, we have the traditional divide between the deity in the sky, the transcendental ideal form of God, and the low mortals, us, living in this pitiful realm which we call Earth. And the traditional idea, the traditional teleological purpose, had been to say, how can we return to the godlike realm? How can we be more like the gods? Many Christians today still sort of function in this kind of logic where they think about how can you be more like Christ? How can you create heaven on earth, etc. This is the transcendental ideal. This means that from an ontic position, you are coming from God, that God has sprinkled his heavenly charisma onto earth, in the literal sense of charisma, and that we human beings have to be reunited with God. This is also where the hierarchy of priesthood comes in, because priests can then interpret what it is that God wants, etc. This is where Kant is one of my favorite theological thinkers, because Kant had this very slightly evil idea about ethics, which we've talked about in this series as well, which is that for Kant, ethics and morality, first of all, they're different, but ethics and morality are not about doing what God wants. Ethics and morality. Are you okay?
Mm-hmm.
You're just sick, aren't you?
No, I'm okay.
I feel really bad that you're here. You don't mind being here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Ethics and morality for Kant. Ethics isn't knowing what God wants. Ethics is having no clue what God wants. In other words, morality then becomes the practice of trying to act as if you knew what God wanted. And so we're stuck in this terribly, from a psychoanalytic perspective, pathological, hysterical relationship to God, which is that if only we knew what God wanted for us, we could act adequately. And since we don't know what God wants from us, we now have to create an entire system designed around together trying to do what we think God might be wanting from us. And if you think that's cynical, for Kant, it's also beautiful, because for Kant, this relates to the idea of love and art itself. Love isn't doing love right. Love is precisely saying, I have no idea what this means and why I'm feeling this way, and everything that I thought was certain and true about my life is suddenly being disrupted, and yet I'm going to somehow be loyal to this love for presumably the rest of my life. And even if I'm not going to be with you the rest of my life, I'm going to act as if I were. It's the ultimate act of irrational madness. And that's what, for Kant, ethics and morality is. It's the ultimate act of irrational madness to throw yourself into a social system designed to collectively somehow designate how to live according to a godlike fashion. Again, we're back at the idea that Lacan has. There is no big other. Just because we can't reach God doesn't mean that we don't have an animating idea for this hysterical relationship to the symbolic order, which for Kant is the moral order, which relates back to the ethical principle of doing that which God deems to be right. Okay, so this all has a point, by the way. I know it seems like we're just going totally off the rails. But, so Kant has basically this idea, which is that ethics and morality isn't about our ability to know what God wants. It's precisely about the inability of us to know what God wants from us. And the Hegelian continuation of this idea, remember we're talking still about Žižek's 3 applications, one of them being Christian, is that in the New Testament, God sends us not an emissary, not a priest, not somebody who's supposed to explain us what God wants from us or what God wants us to do. Recall the famous passage from the Knights of the Holy Grail, the Monty Python one, in which God says, "Stop your groveling." This is the intent of Christ, essentially, is to disrupt the very hierarchy by which there's the lowly people and the high and mighty God. In fact, you could see Christ as the emissary of God's failure to be the transcendental ideal of God. We've talked about this at great length in the previous classes. And so what happens within Christ is it's not, in Christ and the cross specifically, it's not a continuation of the logic of the Old Testament. It's not the next chapter of God's divinity. It's not a sequel. Instead, it's something that fundamentally undermines from within the organizing principle of what had been the theological edifice of the church thus far. Of course, the church not existing, but like the logic of the church, the logic of God. And so with Christ on the cross, we have another example of epor se muove. Christ is dead, and yet it moves. Christ is dead, and yet we have the Holy Trinity. We have the Spirit. We have the community of the faithful on earth. We have a radical revolution that takes place within the structure, the ordering principle of the faith itself that can only be achieved by a kind of inner negation, by a less than nothing, by the logical and imminent conclusion of the contradictions being forced to their imminent demise. If you want to put it in like the most Marxist way. That's what happens with Christ on the cross, is we have the birth of the Holy Spirit, the birth of the community of the faithful, the undermining of the traditional order of being into an entirely new sequence and a new logic, a logic which Hegel would call dialectical. Now, this is where I want to insert like a tiny bit of trivia that I came across the other day, which is when I say radical, I actually mean this not just radical as in radical leftists, but radical as in the Latin root of the word radical. There's already a pun here when I say the radical root of the word radical, because radical in Latin simply means root. Radix means root. Like radish is radish a root vegetable? A root vegetable. And so when you say that something is radical, what you mean is that something is at the root of something. In other words, when you say that something is radical, you mean that it's structural. When you say that something is radical, you mean that it's systemic. And now it'll hopefully make sense to you why quote-unquote radical thinkers today always insist on systemic structures and systemic power structures and systemic relations. The idea being that if you don't address the system, the structural component of something, you've only addressed the symptom. And so instead of addressing the symptom, you have to address the system. It's like saying you have to, I mean, whatever. We can have a lot of platitudes here about curing the disease versus curing, but
Eating more radishes.
yeah, just eat more radishes, basically. Yeah, Jenling grows a lot of radishes, and they are delicious. Okay, so here we have one application of the idea of and yet it moves, the idea of a kind of internal split, a constitutive negativity, the idea of what Žižek calls a less than nothing, something which is not just a negation, but a negation of negation, as Hegel would put it. Remember, the negation of negation would later become the second law within Engel's laws of the dialectic, within dialectical materialism. There's a connection here. If you're interested in dialectics, by the way, quick plug. Last week, we posted a bonus Introduction to Dialectics podcast for our listeners. So on the one hand, we have here a theological argument, something that Hegel traces through religion. On the other hand, we also have a strictly speaking metaphysical argument. Because remember, going all the way back to Plato and to the idea of Platonic idealism, we have a strict metaphysical divide in which we have an ideal plane, that of the ideal form, and the low and debased world of appearances, the world in which humanity functions. This is also how is it an analogy of the cave? Yes?
Allegory.
Allegory. I have like this weird pathological inability to say anything with anal, and so somehow I keep thinking the cave is an analogy because you're creeping out of this giant butt, which is the cave, but it is in fact an allegory. Okay. Longtime listeners will know that this is like, it's like, there's a Reddit somewhere, I should not have discovered this, but there's a Reddit page somewhere dedicated to discussing whether or not I am full of shit. Which is actually like, I am full of shit in many ways, regrettably, but it's always kind of funny. Anyway, so I every week I lend further evidence to this, the public trial of my anyway. Okay, so the
Allegory of the cave.
yeah, the allegory of the cave. I don't have to explain this to anybody, but it's basically this idea that we're all born within the cave, and that you can work your way out of the cave. And that once you are out of the cave, you can come back and teach everybody else how to be out of the cave. It's a slightly crass vulgarization that almost has like overtones of like how people talk about generational wealth today, which is like, if you figure out how to game the system, then you can tell other people in your community and your family how to game the system, etc. And it's, I'm not saying it's manipulative, but it's a basic binary between this idea that we're stuck in the world of illusion, the world of appearances, the cave, and that we have to find a way to crawl out of this cave and to be in the blinding light of pure truth, etc. Now, here you can already see how within the history of human thought, we go from Platonic idealism towards early Christianity, because the transcendental divide between God with a beard in the sky, who is almighty and all-knowing, who will enlighten us with his pure presence of being and bliss in heaven, and we poor mortal souls left to dwell here on earth, that is a continuation of sorts of the Platonic ideal presented within the allegory of the cave. That if we only learn to move ourselves out of the cave, we could go back and help everybody to be. You could find a missionary statement here almost, right? The idea that once you have seen the light, you can bring the light to other people. Now, once again, it's important to note here that Žižek's whole point, and Lacan's whole point, and even Hegel's whole point, is to disrupt this easy binary between the transcendental ideal and the supposedly debased mortal world. Remember, we started this class with saying that just because something is true, just because something is disavowed doesn't make it true, and vice versa, just because something is untrue doesn't make it true. And Lacan says that it's not about the transcendental world behind the world of appearances. The transcendental can only be found within the world of appearances itself. In other words, it's not so much about overcoming the world of illusion. That itself would be the fundamental illusion. This is the most basic definition of ideology. That ideology isn't something that you wake out of or that you wake up from. The ultimate ideological move is to convince you that you are the one who has seen the truth, that you are the one pure soul who has seen the light and must now convince everybody else that they too must see the light. And so if we think about the allegory of the cave, what's probably happening in the cave is that everybody in the cave has convinced themselves that they are not in the cave and that they are somehow better than everybody else.
Well, that they have all somehow escaped the cave and they've returned to the cave to try and convince everyone else to follow them outside the cave.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah. And I know that I'm doing a lot of, like, we've talked about this at great length, but that's inevitable at, like, week 12 of this series that sort of come up. Okay, so we have here a theological divide that's being undermined. Remember, we see Christ on the cross as and yet it moves. Christ is dead, and yet we have the emergence of a wholly new radical order, which is that of the Trinity. It's the idea of the community of the faithful on earth. And we have something similar that happens with Hegel within the idea of metaphysics, within the idea of the Hegelian dialectic and the idea of sublimation, is that in a weird way, we've come to a point in which we've killed the idea of the absolute. And yet it moves, and yet the absolute persists. The absolute functions precisely within its own perceived negation, within its own perceived fall. For the last 15 minutes, remember, we've been talking about Žižek's teleological operation, being that the fall retroactively creates the conditions for that from which it is falling. We've had two examples of this thus far. We have the idea of Christianity, and we had the idea of metaphysics within Plato. Now, what is the third aspect of that? Well, of course, for Žižek, it's Marxism. And you could say specifically dialectical materialism. Žižek is less interested in historical materialism. In other words, Žižek is less interested in the application of ideas about dialectics to sociology and political economy. Instead, he's more interested in the specific way in which, for Engels, but also for Marx, dialectical materialism would change the very Hegelian edifice. It would turn it inside out. Now, what do I mean by that? The basic Hegelian idea is that instead of having the Kantian divide between the essence, the ideal, and the debased world, in which we have to go back to the an sich, we have to find the essence within objects, the truth within the world of the appearances. In a Galilean sense, you could say that in a world in which we have all disavowed what is true, we have to go back to the truth buried within that disavowal. Starting with Hegel, pretty much, in Hegelian dialectics, we suddenly see that this is no longer true. We no longer have a strict division between the ideal and the world of appearances, between the subject and the object. Instead, essence equals appearance for Hegel. Substance equals subject. We have this idea that subjectivity itself becomes the ultimate marker of essence, and that the unfolding of world history is the unfolding of the myriad contradictions by which this gravy train rolls along. Very abstract, I know, but there's many different ways that we can access that idea. What Marx does on a very basic level is simply to say that this process by which the so-called unreal part of objects conditions us happens within the commodity form itself. The famous section about the commodity form isn't just that we treat people like objects and that we treat our life as an object. It's specifically that the way in which we imbue value on a metaphysical conceptual level is about this impossible sequence of completion. What I mean by that is that if you look at the theory of value, it's about das Gleichsetzen des Nicht-Gleichen, as Nietzsche put it. It's about saying, how can we make two things equitable? If you want to trade a cow for a bag of rice, you have to determine what abstract features of the cow would be in the same measure of the abstract features of a bag of rice, whether it's calories, whether it's price, whether it's market value. And so we have here in a very basic operation, which is the basic operation of exchange, we have the very real way in which we imbue something with value, which has real consequences on the real world, through the equation of something that is fundamentally abstract. Now, if you want to see how Marx continues Hegel, one of Hegel's classic, magic trick inversals is to take abstract and concrete and to swap them, to say what is abstract is concrete and vice versa. This is basically what Marx says when it comes to the commodity. That what makes the value of something concrete is its abstract relation to other items. That it's precisely the bourgeois, as he calls it, mentality to focus on the tactile nature of something. Oh, this is such good material. This is so waterproof, etc. Not that that's bad, but that what makes something really valuable isn't what it does, but what it means. And this isn't just branding. This is about saying we can only create the valuation of something in relation to the valuation of something else. In other words, to exchange. Which means that in order to have a fruitful exchange, we need to rely on abstract concepts of value. And what's so important here, and here we come to the eporsimuova part, there is no originating value. There's no value. There's no golden means by which we can measure that value. Instead, that value is purely relational. It is purely a mediation of those two abstractions that come together in a concrete form. In other words, value is uncanny. Value is that which emerges as the third thing, as that which wasn't there to begin with. To say this differently, value for Marx is the Freudian slip. It's not that the original value of the cow or the bag of rice emerges through exchange. It's precisely that a third, uncanny, wholly new substance, value, emerges through the repression of what something originally was in exchange. And that the entire world and the entire way in which we experience our own self through the symbolic order is created through this third thing, through this uncanny object which we call value. And that is what Marx calls the commodity form. And the commodity form is, in that sense, strictly speaking, uncanny. It wasn't there originally. Instead, it came through the precise abstraction. You see already here the contradiction in terms of our relation to the commodity. And so when Marx says that we ourselves become structures like commodities, it's not that we learn to sell ourselves on the internet, which of course people learn to do. It's not that we learn to keep up appearances. It's precisely that subjectivity functions in the same way. What is the value of a life? What is the value of being able to participate in a society? What does it mean to exist becomes related to this third uncanny thing, which was itself an emanation from the abstraction which became concrete. Eporsimuove. Just because it's not real doesn't mean it ain't true. This is also why Marx, literally in the opening passages on the commodity fetish, writes that if you taught somebody about the fetish and you taught them to see through the fetish, it wouldn't change anything. Just because the fetish is false, in other words, just because the fetish is a fetish, doesn't make it untrue. And so the ultimate ideological metaphysical illusion is to say, oh, we have to peek behind the curtain to find the truth. Oh, if we go back behind the curtain of value, we will find the original form of the point of having a cow or something like this. That, in fact, the truth is the falsehood. The truth lies within the abstraction that creates value. And this is where we start getting close to the idea of utopia. But before, let's take a step back and see what we've just done. We said that Žižek's teleological operation is to say that something emerges through the fall itself. We've seen how that functions within Christianity, where Christ is the uncanny figure on the cross, who is undead in his moment of demise, Easter Monday being the moment of resurrection. Resurrection here, and is what? No?
Easter Sunday.
Did I say? Yeah, but it's Easter Monday today, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the Monday after Easter. Anyway.
I call that Easter Monday. The moment of resurrection isn't the moment of getting up from the cross. It isn't the moment of floating into heaven. It's specifically the moment of an entire revolution of the heavens themselves. Think about it. If the heaven is here and earth is here and Christ is in the middle, Christ is the uncanny figure of X. And it's not that Christ goes up into heaven. It's that around Christ, there's this rumbling sound, and we go, and suddenly the world is upside down after the crucifixion. It's that heaven is no longer the ideal form. Now heaven is down here. Heaven has been emptied out of its formal content. It has emerged essence in its truest form through the fall. And that axis is the figure of Christ, the uncanny figure of Christ on the cross. The same is true within the metaphysical divide and the leap that Hegel makes after Kant, which is that if we think about Hegel as being this uncanny figure within the metaphysical divide, there is no philosophy after Hegel. In other words, in the classic trajectory, of transcendental idealism, of trying to go towards the ideal, finding the essence within objects as Ding an sich, Hegel emerges, and suddenly philosophy is stuck. Philosophy doesn't progress after Hegel. It's precisely why the anti-philosophers like Lacan become the new philosophers. Because in the wheel of the transcendental edifice, in which we have the ideal and the debased world, we suddenly have a Hegelian Christ-like figure. It's also why Hegel really did say that he was the end of history. Hegel said, I myself am the end of philosophy. Talk about illusions of grandeur, but this is what he meant, is that suddenly we have the system by which it turns, and who pops out? Of course, it's Marx. Because now we have a materialist theory of the ideal. The ideal being utopia. The idea, the emergence of essence, the traditional holy grail of the metaphysical project being made manifest within the world of material relations, which is what Marx is trying to do. And here we have to start reaching the end of this lecture series because we're going to be talking about utopia. This entire lecture series was dedicated to the idea of utopia. And I want to explain that now in just 10 minutes because we have 10 minutes left. Remember, what is the title of this lecture series and the title of the accompanying book that'll be coming out in 2 weeks? Where nothing is lacking. And throughout this lecture series, we've talked about the way in which utopia would be about the Marxist idea of a universal that doesn't succumb to its particular. Sartre once had a very utopian statement when Sartre said that in every particular, we find the universal in its purest form. This is basically a Marxist idea that you always have a disavowed element within the universal. In other words, every universal is false. And that there is, through the upholding of the fetish of that universal, there's always one element that escapes it, and that element contains the truth. For example, capitalism, which is presented to us as a, let's call it a meritocracy, right? In which as long as you participate freely and with good intentions and hard work and labor, you too will have the same chances everybody else will have. Of course, pretty much everybody knows that this is not true. That there is systemic and structural inequality built into the very edifice of capitalism, which means that you will never be likely to compete in an equal fashion with others because your very inability to compete in said manner is what allows them to succeed. In other words, if it were a free competition, there would be no more capitalist success on the level that we see today. Now, that has to be disavowed somehow, and the way in which we disavow it is by upholding through cultural mores, through education, through many different ways, the idea of there being this ladder that we can walk up. However, the embodied truth underneath that lie is, of course, what Marx called workers' class consciousness. And the whole point of post-Marxism has been to say it's not just about being, quote-unquote, literally working class, because we don't live in an industrial or even post-industrial society anymore, that being working class is being part of the group of people who have been told that they have access to a universal that they don't have access to. In other words, that it's not only that you don't have access, but that you don't have access because you're told you have access. In a similar way to, we've decided that the way to make capitalism more equal is to democratize investing, for example. This is the fundamental pathological disavowal within Marxism, that within Freudian slip, within capitalism, that if only we make the participation in capitalism more equal, capitalism will be more equal.
Well, more widely available. You
Yeah.
can see that in the critiques of microfinance in third world countries, particularly India and Mexico. You know, if only women were able to take out loans to start their own small businesses in their homes, then they could be, you know, they could jumpstart their own domestic economies, which is...
This is the moment every week where we say, generally teach a political economy class. We'd really like that. I know, I'm not speaking just for myself here. And of course, we could make Lacanian arguments here also about how the basic point of structuralism is to say that the only thing that is truly universal is difference itself. In other words, that, again, to go back to Sartre, the only true heart of the universal emerges within the particular. Now, Lacan's not a Marxist, but this is a Marxist idea, the idea that the class consciousness isn't the moment that you realize the cliche of like, we're in the majority, you know what I mean? Like the 1% is evil, but we are going to take over. That isn't class consciousness. Class consciousness is the point at which you realize that your access that was sold to you to the market was the very condition of your own enslavement. That the whole narrative of your own subjective freedom was the way in which you were being kept in check. Now, there's still a level of control here, which is that to believe in such a control is a kind of control. To believe that there's a shady figure or group of people who are manipulating you intentionally on this manner is itself part of the illusion. The truth, for Marx, to go back to the commodity form, is that we all collectively do it to ourselves. That we are all acting and participating in this manner, not because we don't know better, but precisely because we know better, and we think that somehow this is the only option that we have. Class consciousness is the realization that you can do a lot more than you think you can, that there are many different ways in which you can collectively live in a way that is radically different because it is not subject to the governing logic principle. In other words, the incentive structure that you have been brought up in. It comes down to incentive structures. Structures of incentive are the structures that make you desire in a certain way. They create the object causes of desire. The ultimate emancipatory act is therefore not to say, I will cease to desire, I will stop participating, I will exempt myself from the system, the governing principle of desire. That would itself be a kind of ideology. Instead, it's to say, I will become a more active agent of my own desiring, and through that, I will start to objectively change the object causes of desire. In other words, I will change the way in which desire is generated within our governing society and order of being. That's been the project that we try to do here. It's utopian in nature because we've said, why not teach classes on the internet? Why not make them free and open access? Why not go all out without having to apologize for the fact that we're passionate about this stuff? Why not is a surprisingly powerful question. Remember, why not is also at the heart at most nihilistic acts of wanton torture and devastation. Why not is a dangerous question, but if you harness the power of why not, you can also do a lot. When Jelly and I talk about this as the universe shrugs. The universe is not going to stop you. Okay, this is enough of a self-help talk. We're going to go back to the final part. So this lecture is called Where Nothing is Lacking. And I'd originally suggested that this is an argument about utopia. That a utopia would be a universal that doesn't succumb to a particular. A universal that doesn't require pathological attachment, a disavowal of the particular come universal. And that the Marxist idea of a utopia would be a place that is truly universal, with true universal participation. But that has not really been my point. That has not been my agenda. That's not the kind of Marxist I am. Instead, the point of the title of this lecture series, Where Nothing is Lacking, is to say, it's where nothing is lacking. In other words, it's not a place of purity in which there is nothing lacking. It's not an ideal, a transcendental realm. It's not another heaven. It's not another utopian space in which there is no particular. It's not
a place of no lacks.
It's not a place of no lacks. It's not the positing of an ideal transcendental form. Instead, it's about saying where nothing is lacking, constitutive negativity. Nothing actively lacks. And it is this less than nothing, this actively lacking, that is the true utopian core of subjectivity. I believe this very, very strongly. And I don't just hold it as a belief, I hold it also as, I think, something that we can argue, in fact, that we have argued for 12 weeks. That the point of utopia isn't out there beyond the curtain of appearances. That the world of utopia isn't even a universal that doesn't succumb to its own particular. That the world of utopia isn't a collectivist fantasy. The utopian kernel is precisely the kernel of your own subjectivity, of the radical constitutive negativity of the split subject, of what it means to be you, as an unfinished project, as a place of pure opportunity and potential. That, in a weird way, it is not ever enough just to be you. That you are an agent of negation, but also an agent of completion. You look for love, you look for connection, you look for suffering, you look for joy, you look for ideas. That as soon as you are born, you are in a state of radical unaloneness. and that you have to navigate that path, and that this incompleteness that you have within yourself is precisely complete. That the only universal is difference itself. In other words, that the truest form of utopia isn't something where nothing is lacking. It's where nothing is lacking. That core is within the heart of your own subjectivity and subjective consciousness and being. That it's not about being, but it's about becoming. And that within the process of becoming, within the process of incompleteness that you experience on a day-to-day basis, and within the responsibility, both ethical and moral, that you have to navigate that divide, that chasm between what you want and who you are, that there is something utopian there, that there is an essence there, that if we're looking for the ideal and the purest form of life and love itself, that it's to be found right here. And that the irony is that we can't access it. We can't dig into it. We find it through connection with others. We find it through love. We find it through participation in the world. As soon as you are no longer contemporary, you have started to bury yourself. But as long as you're alive to the world, both to the joys and the agonies of the world, as long as you're alive to the news, as long as you're alive to art, as long as you're alive to everything that other people are doing to try to bring this place into a kind of life, whether it's through expression, through community, through baking, through gardening, through writing, through reading, whether it's through all these futile acts, that's where we find the utopian core of what it means to be alive. That's how we scratch underneath the surface of less than nothing. And that if we're lucky, we might have these fragments of a moment in which we feel like we've tapped into essence. And an essence that we realize can only ever be grasped as it flows through our fingers. And I know that that might be poetic language and abstract language, and yet I believe that it is only poetic and abstract language that grants us access to the truth. That fiction is a truth that tells a lie. And that it's precisely the idea of a pure, objective, empirical truthhood that contains the opportunity and the possibility for falsehood. And that the Galilean idea of epro se muove, or and yet it moves, isn't just a principle about the movement of history for Marx, the movement of the faith for religion, the movement of spirit for Hegel, the movement of the subject for Lacan, but it's also specifically about the movement of hope within this vessel that we call subjective experience. And that as we flow through that process that we call life, that each and every one of us contains the key to a utopia, which is not going through the heavenly gates. It's not arriving at a moment in which everything makes sense. It's not leading the best or the most perfect life. It's not being the best person who never hurts anybody else, including yourself. It's about finding a point and an acceptance, which is radical in that it is structural and systemic. That the utopian core that lives within you right now isn't about finding a place where nothing is lacking. It's not about finding a place in which you are perfect, in which you've never screwed up. It's about realizing that you are already that where nothing is lacking, that there is a constitutive negativity at the core of your being, a paradox which Lacan and Freud called the death drive, that animates and creates the objective conditions for your experience of life through fallibility. And that it is through that fallibility that you are in a place where nothing is lacking. That's the lecture series, where nothing is lacking. Wrap that up.
Yes.
12 weeks.
12 weeks. All 12 weeks will be saved.
All week.
So feel free to.
Yeah, can you do it?
Revisit.
Can you briefly explain to people what the...
Yeah, of course. So, let's see. All of the classes, all of these hour-long classes are saved. They're available, they're archived, they're on both YouTube and Instagram. In addition, we have a Patreon. We're grateful for everyone's support. Thank you so much. We have so many wonderful supporters who are active on our Discord. And we're actually going to be going over to Discord right now. We're going to host a 1-hour discussion Q&A where we just kind of talk about whatever we're feeling like talking about. And we take questions, and we have a wonderful Discord community where people share their own writing and their own questions and answers. And so the Discord is available to join. Check out our Patreon, which link in bio, I think. You can also download a PDF transcript, because I know sometimes the YouTube subtitles are a little wonky. And if you want to refer back to the lecture, at least for me, text is preferable to a video. So if you're interested in that, those are available on Patreon. We post them every week, in addition to audio downloads of both the class and the Discord discussion. Also, the last couple weeks for ebook to be available. What am I missing?
That's right. Long story short,
Long story short.
every Monday we teach this class live and for free. And I'm so grateful to Jenlene for editing the transcripts, for doing the DMs and the Patreon. It's been a wonderful 12 weeks. It's been a lecture series called Where Nothing is Lacking. Every class is saved on Instagram and YouTube. And we're so grateful that you're here. Yes. And we hope that you'll stick around and enjoy our learning community. Yep. Final plug. 2 more weeks to get my previous book, and then it disappears. It's gonna be gone forever. So 2 more weeks. You can find all of that and more on
patreon.com/Jenlene and Julian.
Or click the link in bio. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys, and we'll see you on Discord in a couple minutes.